A few months ago, my girlfriend and I decided to take a hike through a trail in the woods. It was one of those days where the weather was perfect, not too hot, with the sun shining brightly but not too intensely. We'd been walking for hours, just taking it slow, enjoying the peace of the outdoors. The trail wound through the forest with trees towering above us, their leaves creating a soft rustling sound in the breeze. The kind of peace that made you feel removed from the world, where you could forget everything for a while and just focus on the steps ahead. We were deep into the trail, far enough that I didn't think we'd run into anyone else. There wasn't much sign of other hikers either, which made it feel even more remote. It was just us, the forest, and the occasional chirp of birds high in the trees. We hadn't seen any wildlife yet, other than a few birds and squirrels skittering through the trees, but I wasn't concerned. This was supposed to be a calming, relaxing hike. But as we made our way down the trail, I noticed a faint sound in the distance. It was a rustling in the brush to the left, and it was getting louder. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sound seemed more deliberate, like something or someone moving through the undergrowth. My girlfriend, who had been walking a few paces ahead of me, must have heard it too. "I think it's a deer, babe," she whispered over her shoulder, her voice calm. I looked at her and then glanced around, trying to figure out what it could be. I couldn't see anything through the thick trees and underbrush, but whatever it was, it sounded big. Too big to be a deer. The noise was moving closer now, snapping branches and rustling leaves, and it was clear that whatever it wasn't trying to hide. My heart rate picked up. I'm no expert on wild animals, but I'd spent enough time outdoors to know that a deer wouldn't make that much noise. It was something else, something bigger, something much heavier. The sound grew louder, closer, and I felt my muscles tense up instinctively. I wasn't scared yet, but I could tell that something wasn't right. I was about to say something to her when I froze, staring down the trail in front of me. A giant black paw landed heavily on the dirt. It was unmistakable. I could feel my stomach drop as my brain quickly pieced together what I was seeing. A black bear, a huge one, and it was walking right toward us. Before I could react, my girlfriend screamed, "F-U-C-K!" Her voice was high-pitched, panic rising, and she was already running in the opposite direction before I could process what was happening. Her legs pumping in a blur, feet barely touching the ground as she tore off into the woods. I stood there, frozen for a split second, staring at the bear as it moved slowly, calmly toward the trail. Its fur was dark as night, its massive body looking like a shadow in the woods. Its eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, it was like time stopped. The bear didn't growl or roar. It didn't do anything aggressive. It just stared at me. I was maybe 10 yards away from it, and I could feel its gaze like it was piercing through me. I didn't know if it was sizing me up or if it was just curious, but I could see that it was massive. This was no small bear. This was a 300 to 350-pound beast, easily the size of a small car, with thick, muscular legs and claws that could tear through anything. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I had heard plenty of bear stories, how not to run, how to avoid startling them, how to make yourself look bigger. But none of that was going through my mind right now. All I could think was how close the bear was, how dangerous it could be, and how quickly I needed to move. But I didn't. I stayed there for a moment longer, rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on the bear. It wasn't charging, it wasn't attacking, it was just walking. Slowly, almost lazily, as if it didn't even care we were there. Its huge paws padded along the dirt trail, making barely any sound, like it owned the place. Then, without warning, I snapped out of my trance. My body finally caught up with my brain. I turned and started running, adrenaline hitting my bloodstream like a shot of pure energy. My legs moved faster than I thought they could, and I didn't even look back. I wasn't gonna stick around to see what happened. As I sprinted, I stole a quick glance behind me. I expected the bear to be chasing us, but instead, it was calmly crossing the trail, paying no attention to us at all. It wasn't running, it wasn't lunging after us. It just walked across the dirt path, one paw after another, like it had all the time in the world. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or even more terrified. Maybe the bear wasn't as interested in us as I thought, or maybe it just hadn't decided if we were a threat yet. But either way, it didn't matter. I wasn't waiting around to find out. I was gaining on my girlfriend now. She had veered off the trail into the woods, running like a maniac, her feet kicking up dirt as she plowed through the undergrowth. She wasn't paying attention to where she was going, and I could see she was getting farther from the trail with each step. I shouted for her to stop, but she was already in full panic mode, her breath coming in short gasps. She was so lost in fear that she hadn't even noticed that she was about to run right back into the bear's path. I reached her just as she was about to turn into an area thick with trees, a part of the woods where we couldn't see a thing. She was breathing hard, her face pale. She looked like she was about to collapse from sheer panic. We stopped and stared at each other for a second, both of us trying to catch our breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I knew we had to get out of there, fast. I pulled my backpack off and fumbled around inside. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely get a grip on my knife, but eventually, I pulled it free. It was just a small folding knife, not much, but it was something. I looked at my girlfriend, who was still wide-eyed, her face a mixture of shock and fear. "Let's go," I said, though it didn't really sound like me. My voice was tight, strained from the panic and adrenaline. We didn't wait any longer. We turned around and started running back toward the trail, our feet crashing through the brush as we picked our way through the undergrowth. We didn't look back. We didn't stop to breathe, to slow down, or to even think about what had just happened. We just ran. The trail felt like it took forever to reach, and my legs were starting to burn, but there was no way I was stopping now. We reached the clearing where we had parked our truck, and the relief was almost overwhelming. I could see the headlights in the distance, shining through the trees, waiting for us like a beacon. We didn't say anything as we climbed into the truck. Neither of us had the energy to speak. We both just stared straight ahead, breathing heavily, our chests still tight from the panic that gripped us. I started the engine and pulled away slowly, making sure to watch the rearview mirror for any sign of movement in the woods behind us. We didn't talk much the rest of the way back. There was just a quiet understanding between us, what had happened, how close we had come to something terrible. It didn't feel like a close call. It felt like we had just survived something that could have gone very differently. And for that, I was grateful. Looking back now, I can still feel the weight of those moments, the way time seemed to slow down when I saw that bear, the way everything felt so heavy in my chest. But we made it. We got out of there in one piece, and that's what mattered. We're both more careful now when we go hiking, more aware of our surroundings. Sometimes the woods feel peaceful, but you never know what could be lurking just out of sight. I live in the Black Hills, a place that's as beautiful as it is intimidating. Towering pines, rolling hills, and the endless expanse of rugged wilderness make it a perfect place for people who enjoy the outdoors. It's also home to mountain lions. Known by some as pumas or cougars, these big cats are a silent presence in the area, moving through the woods with an eerie grace. I've spent a lot of time hiking, camping, and exploring these hills, but there's always that lingering awareness of the predators that roam these lands. I suppose you get used to it, or at least that's what I tell myself. One weekend, my now husband, Jake, and I decided to go camping. It had been a while since we had a real getaway, just the two of us, so we thought it would be nice to head out into the woods. We invited our friend Tim along, who was definitely not an outdoorsman. Tim liked the idea of camping, but only if there were enough amenities to keep him comfortable. He wasn't a hiker, didn't have much experience with camping gear, and most importantly, he didn't know how to handle himself in the woods. We set up camp by a small clearing surrounded by thick trees. It was a peaceful spot, away from the usual crowds of tourists and campers. The air was crisp, the smell of pine filled the air, and the only sound was the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. Tim spent most of the afternoon lounging around the fire, sipping on beers, and trying to convince Jake and me that he could totally handle roughing it. I'd been camping in these woods enough times to know that when it came to camping, Tim's version of roughing it meant a fancy chair by the fire and a cooler full of snacks. The first night went off without a hitch. We had a great time cooking over the fire, telling stories, and just enjoying the quiet of the wilderness. As the sun set and the stars began to fill the sky, we settled into our tent. I'd set up my sleeping bag and was already half asleep when I heard Tim mumble something about not feeling so great. He'd had more than a few drinks, so I figured he was just a little too tipsy. But then, in the middle of the night, I woke up to hear him getting sick outside the tent. It was dark, and the sound of Tim retching echoed through the woods. At first, I thought it was just the result of too much alcohol, but the more I listened, the more I realized something felt off. There was a sort of heaviness to the air, a stillness that didn't sit right with me. I tried to shake it off, but it wasn't long before I heard it. Rustling. Not the wind, not the usual movement of animals through the underbrush, but something deliberate, something bigger. I turned to Jake, who was already awake. He had heard it too. "I'll take him back to the truck," Jake whispered, his voice steady but low. "You stay here. I'll be back as quick as I can." I hesitated. There were too many things about this situation that didn't feel right. The rustling was louder now, and it wasn't just the sound of small animals scavenging for food. I was sure of it. I nodded reluctantly, though the unease creeping up my spine told me I wasn't comfortable with the idea of being alone in the middle of the night. Jake packed up some essentials, a flashlight, a small first aid kit, and his jacket, and then he left, guiding Tim down the trail towards the truck. I stayed in the tent, alone. It didn't take long before I regretted my decision. The first few minutes were fine, just the sound of the fire crackling outside and the soft wind pushing through the trees. But then it came again, the rustling closer this time. I could hear it moving behind the tent, just out of view. I grabbed my hatchet, which was tucked in the corner of the tent, and the small multi-tool I always kept on me. My fingers were cold, and despite myself, my breathing had quickened. I grabbed the flashlight and flicked it on, scanning the dark trees outside the tent. Nothing. The beam of light only revealed the shadows of the pines, the occasional flicker of a branch moving in the wind, but nothing that looked dangerous. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the weight of the sounds, the deliberate steps, kept me on edge. I sat there, straining my ears, listening. The rustling stopped, only to be replaced by low, guttural grunts. Something was moving in the brush, moving slowly and methodically, as if it was circling the camp. My heart raced and I gripped the hatchet tighter. I could hear it now, the sounds of heavy breathing and faint movement, almost like something stalking, testing the air. Then I heard it, the scream of a cat, the kind of scream that stops your heart, that makes your skin crawl. A mountain lion, unmistakably. The sound sliced through the night, echoing across the clearing. My throat went dry, and I froze. I'd heard mountain lions scream before, but never this close, never this loud. I had always known they were out there, but hearing one so near, knowing it was close enough to be on the hunt, made every instinct in my body scream to get out. But there was no way I was going to leave the tent now. I could only wait. The minutes dragged on, each one stretching longer than the last. My mind raced, trying to come up with any logical explanation for what was happening. Maybe the mountain lion had caught a deer, maybe it was just passing through. But everything in me told me it wasn't that simple. The way it had moved, the way it had paused, it felt deliberate, like it knew I was there. I kept the flashlight in my hand, shining it out of the tent every few minutes, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever it was that had been circling. But the trees were too thick and the shadows too deep. I could hear the grunts again, closer this time. They sounded almost human, like a low growl mixed with a grunt, a sound I'd never heard from any animal I'd known. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. The thought of a mountain lion moving around my tent, so close, was enough to make my stomach churn. I kept telling myself that I was being paranoid, that the cat had long since moved on. But I knew it wasn't true. It was still out there, and it wasn't going anywhere. The minutes felt like hours. I finally heard the sound of footsteps again, but this time it was unmistakable. There was a shift in the air, the faintest brush of leaves against fur, and the grunt that followed was low and ominous. It was so close that I could almost feel the heat of its body through the fabric of the tent. I held my breath, my eyes wide and unblinking. I fumbled for my phone, hoping to call Jake. But of course, the service was non-existent. My only options were the hatchet and the flashlight. Neither seemed like much against a predator that weighed hundreds of pounds. I strained my ears, listening for any sound of movement that would indicate the lion was moving away. But instead, the grunt grew louder, deeper, more urgent, as though the cat was testing its prey, weighing its options. It was a chilling, primal sound that made my skin crawl. Suddenly, there was a crack. A branch snapped in the underbrush, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy paws patting softly on the earth. I couldn't help it, I gasped. My breath came in sharp, panicked bursts. Just then, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching quickly from the path. Jake, my heart almost stopped from relief. He burst into the clearing, flashlight scanning the area in all directions. Tim was still with him, looking pale and disoriented. Jake scanned the area quickly and, without missing a beat, ushered me out of the tent, pulling me towards the truck. "Let's go," Jake said, his voice calm but with an edge of urgency. "Now." We didn't stop running until we were safely back at the truck. Tim slumped in the passenger seat. I glanced back at the camp one last time, my heart still racing. The Black Hills were beautiful, yes, but they were also home to things I wasn't ready to face alone. As we drove back down the winding trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, just beyond the trees, watching. The day had started like any other backpacking trip into the backcountry. Quiet, peaceful, just me and the wild. The kind of silence that surrounds you out here, far away from civilization, can be overwhelming at times. The wind whispered through the trees, the occasional splash of water from birds diving into the lake, and the soft crunch of my boots on the dirt path. Everything felt normal, as it should be. Miles deep in the woods, just me and nature. The kind of place where no one would find you unless they were specifically looking. I had been following the trail for hours, pushing through dense forest, trying to get closer to the lake I had read about in the guidebook. The water was supposed to be pristine, a quiet retreat. I needed to refill my water bottle, and the path had started to drop down to the edge of the lake, the incline steep but manageable. I made my way down the slippery bank, the ground soft beneath my boots as I reached the water. The lake stretched out in front of me, the early evening sun glinting off the surface. I bent down and cupped my hands, filling my bottle with water, the coolness of it refreshing against my dry lips. I took a deep breath, savoring the stillness. This was why I came out here, peace. Just a few days to myself, no distractions, no noise. It had been a few months since I had been able to really get away, to lose myself in the wild. As I stood back up, I turned around to begin the climb back to the trail, but I froze. At first, I thought I might be imagining things, my mind playing tricks on me after hours of solitude. But there, just ahead, near the top of the bank, was a figure. A large man, standing still, wearing a camouflage jacket that blended perfectly with the surroundings. His stance was rigid, his gaze focused directly on me. He didn't move, but I could feel him watching me, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Then I saw it, a glint of metal in his hand, a handgun. My stomach dropped. The realization hit me hard, the heavy weight of the situation crashing down. He hadn't seen me coming, or if he had, he didn't expect me to be where I was. It wasn't just the sight of him, but the sudden awareness that I had walked straight into someone's territory. My heart began to race as I instinctively raised my hands, palms open in a gesture of surrender. I could feel the cold sweat on my neck, the kind of sweat that isn't from the heat but from the very real fear that grips you when you realize something dangerous is happening. The man's eyes didn't leave me. He didn't move for a long time, and I didn't move either, afraid that even the slightest wrong gesture might make things worse. Then, slowly, his grip on the gun loosened, and he lowered it slightly, still keeping it pointed in my general direction but not at my chest anymore. He spoke, but I didn't catch what he said. The words were muffled, like they came from a distance. "Thought you were a cougar," he said, his voice low and raspy. I blinked, trying to make sense of it. A cougar? What was he talking about? He didn't wait for a response before continuing, his tone shifting to something more anxious, more paranoid. "Where you been? What trail you come from?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as if trying to size me up, trying to figure out if I was a threat. His gaze flickered over me, scanning, like I wasn't just a woman in the woods, but something more dangerous, something to be feared. The way he asked the questions made me feel like I was being interrogated. I didn't answer at first, couldn't. My mind was scrambling, trying to piece together the situation, trying to figure out what kind of person I was dealing with. There was something about the way he stood there, his clothes, his hand near the gun, the way his eyes darted around the woods as though checking for something, someone, that set off alarms in my head. His eyes darted nervously between me and the trees, as though he were constantly looking over his shoulder. "You came alone?" he asked next, and I realized the suspicion in his voice had nothing to do with me. It had everything to do with what I might have stumbled into. I was alone. I had come here to be alone, to escape everything for a while. But the moment he asked about my being alone, my stomach turned. Was he just being cautious? Or was he hiding something? Something out here, far from civilization, deep in the woods? My gut told me it was the latter. His constant shifting gaze, the way his hand twitched near the gun, it all felt wrong. He started asking more questions, rapid fire, like he wasn't really listening for answers but trying to figure out if I knew something. "You seen anyone else out here?" He shifted again, moving slightly to one side, then back, his hand still close to the gun. It was like he was trying to hide something, to keep whatever it was from being discovered. I could feel it now, a growing tension in the air, something I couldn't put my finger on. I glanced around the trees, hoping to spot something, anything, that might explain his odd behavior. But all I saw was the dense forest stretching out in every direction. It didn't take long before I realized the truth. There was something about him that didn't add up. The way he was so on edge, the constant questions, the way he kept looking around like he was expecting someone to show up at any moment. I tried to keep my voice steady, replying that I hadn't seen anyone, that I had just been following the trail. My words sounded hollow in my own ears. What did he want? What was he so afraid of? I stood there, my heart pounding, trying to read his face, to figure out what he was thinking. But I couldn't. The longer I stood there, the more uncomfortable I became, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. His posture softened just a little, but his eyes remained sharp, like he was still waiting for something. He didn't say much after that, just gave me one last look before turning and disappearing into the trees. I stood there for a long time, frozen, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. What had I just encountered? A paranoid man in the woods with a gun, asking questions, watching me like I was some kind of intruder. I didn't wait around to find out more. My instincts screamed at me to move, to get away from him before whatever situation he was in escalated. I turned and made my way back up the bank, scrambling to reach the trail and put as much distance between myself and that man as I could. My heart was still racing, my hands clammy, but I kept walking, my eyes darting nervously over my shoulder. After a while, I began to calm down. Maybe he was just a hunter, someone who had wandered too far into the backcountry, lost in his own paranoia. Maybe there was no pot farm, no illegal operation out there. But the more I thought about it, the less convinced I was of that. There was something off about him, something I couldn't ignore. The rest of my hike was uneventful, and I eventually reached my next campsite, setting up quickly and trying to push the encounter out of my mind. But I never forgot the way he had looked at me, the way his eyes had searched mine, and the way he had been so quick to lower the gun after thinking I was a cougar. What if he wasn't just some paranoid man lost in the woods? What if he was hiding something darker out there? The questions lingered in my mind long after I left the woods, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something dangerous. The feeling stayed with me, even long after I returned home, safe and sound. Something about that encounter didn't sit right, and it took a while before I could shake the uneasy sense of being watched. And then there was the cougar. It wasn't a coincidence, not at all. I had been stalked. The signs were there, the feeling of being watched, the way the hair on the back of my neck had stood up when I thought I saw something moving in the trees behind me. It wasn't just the man with the gun that had made my heart race. There had been something else, something following me from the shadows. It's a strange feeling, knowing you're being stalked, knowing that someone wants to make you their prey. You don't see it at first, but you feel it. You feel the eyes on you, the silent presence lurking in the dark. And it makes you realize that, in the wild, you are never truly alone. I never went back to that part of the woods. Something told me it was best to leave the mystery unsolved, to let the forest keep its secrets. But I'll always remember that day, and I'll always remember the way it felt to be watched. I remember that weekend like it was yesterday, though it was years ago. The memory of it is etched in my mind, and even now, when I close my eyes, I can still feel the discomfort, the unease, the way the daylight had this strange, gray quality, like everything was drenched in fog, even though there was none. I had been out in the woods, exploring a part of the country that had been largely forgotten by time. It was the sort of place where nothing modern was left untouched by the ravages of history. Even the air felt thick with the past, as though the echoes of long-forgotten lives hung around every tree and every stone. The area was dotted with remnants of old Civil War-era buildings, slowly crumbling into oblivion. Rusted iron beams, shattered bricks, and splintered wood. Once, these structures had been full of life. Now, they stood as silent monuments to lives lived in isolation, to lives that had probably been full of desperation and madness. You can imagine how it felt walking around in those woods. The kind of woods where your footsteps echoed off walls that had once been home to families. Families who had probably fought and bled just to survive in those miserable hills. I had read about the folklore surrounding these places. Stories of men driven mad by the solitude, the long winters, the unyielding hardships of farm life during that time. People who snapped and did things no one should ever do. The stories said that some had even killed their own children or their wives. And when I walked among the ruins of those places, I didn't know if it was my imagination or if it was something deeper, something instinctive, but it made my skin crawl. It felt like the ghosts of those who had gone mad were still lingering there. There was one farmhouse that particularly stood out to me. It wasn't large, but it had a presence to it. An old, two-story structure, the kind of place you could imagine as a family's home, surrounded by a small field that had long since been overgrown. I couldn't help but notice the piles of deer bones near what looked like a mattress. The mattress was stained with something dark, probably blood, and there were bits of broken furniture scattered about, as though someone had just given up on living there. Old bottles of liquor lay scattered, their foul contents long since evaporated. Leather straps had been nailed into the walls, worn and weathered by time, but still holding onto the memory of their use. It looked as though whoever had lived there had been scraping by for years, barely hanging on to whatever semblance of a life they had left. As I stepped deeper into the house, I felt my foot catch on something sharp. Looking down, I saw a rusted blade sticking out from a pile of debris. Just a few inches away, there were more blades, all with jagged edges. The kind of thing that could easily tear into your skin and, worse, leave you with a fatal dose of tetanus if you weren't careful. That's the thing about these old places, they were riddled with dangers like that. No one had bothered to clean them up, and no one had cared enough to make them safe. A few feet inside the door, I spotted a black widow spider sitting in the corner. It wasn't the kind of thing you could easily ignore, especially not when you're already on edge. And I had barely stepped into the house, just a few seconds, and I was already finding dangers like that. I left quickly, my boots crunching over the dried leaves outside. It wasn't hard to imagine that the people who had lived there had long since gone mad. The isolation, the lack of anything resembling community, the slow, painful erosion of sanity. These things would do it to a person. And those stories about men killing their families? It was easy to see how they might be true. No one ever talked about the people who lived here anymore. But I knew deep down that they had been real, that they had existed, and they had probably met a tragic end out here in the middle of nowhere. My legs carried me away from that place, but the image of the ruined house stuck with me. I knew I couldn't shake it off. It was one of those things that stayed with you, like a smell that clings to your clothes. I walked deeper into the woods, passing by more of those shacks and huts, the remnants of whatever fleeting existence people had carved out of the land. Each structure was a little more disheveled than the last. Tin roofs, rusted nails, the stench of old beer cans and cigarette butts that had been scattered everywhere. Their presence a testament to the people who had lived here. But these weren't homes. Not really. They were shelters, temporary things meant for escape. Whoever had built them had been running from something. Maybe they were hunters or outlaws. Maybe they were people who had just wanted to get away from society for good. Or maybe they were families who had gotten lost in the vastness of the land. Whatever the case, they were all alone. And as I walked through the woods, I realized something. These places, these so-called homes, were all designed to isolate people from the world. And once someone had chosen that kind of life, they couldn't come back. There was no way out. The farther I walked, the more these abandoned places began to disturb me. There was something unsettling about them. More than just the decay, more than the knowledge that people had lived and died in these places. It was the realization that they had all been built out of desperation. Some of these shelters had been hastily thrown together with sheet metal, a few 2x4s, and a single mattress, still fairly new but surrounded by trash. Empty beer cans, cigarette butts, and .22 caliber shells were scattered about. Who had built these, and why? What had driven them to live like this? It became clear to me that no one came here by accident. You didn't end up in these woods unless you had a reason to be here. Maybe you were running from something, or maybe you were just too broken to care anymore. Either way, the longer I stayed, the more I realized that the woods were full of people who had been lost to time, living on the fringes of society. They weren't criminals or outcasts necessarily. They were just people who had gotten too far away from everything to ever return. I hadn't planned to stay out there long, but as I wandered deeper into the forest, something changed. It wasn't the landscape or the history that began to disturb me. It was the growing sense of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a tightness settled in my chest. I wasn't alone anymore. That much was certain. I'd always thought of the woods as a place of peace, a place where you could lose yourself. But now, it felt like a place of tension, of pressure, as though something was waiting for me to make a mistake. It wasn't an animal or a person, but something else, something older. It was a feeling I couldn't shake, one that gnawed at me as I kept walking, my mind racing with all the stories I'd heard about hermits and loners, about people who spent years in the woods, slowly losing their grip on reality. I turned back after a while, but by the time I retraced my steps, the light had begun to fade. It wasn't full darkness yet, but the sky was gray, almost unnatural, as though the day itself had been bled of its color. That feeling of being watched intensified, and I found myself looking over my shoulder every few steps. The woods didn't feel like they were meant to be explored anymore. They felt like a place that had been forgotten, abandoned by everyone except those who had been driven to it by some force outside of their control. As I made my way back to the main trail, I spotted a structure up ahead. It was just another shack like the others I had seen, but something about it caught my attention. It wasn't just the way it was built or the worn-out look of it. It was the fact that the door was ajar. That wasn't normal. These shacks had been abandoned, left to rot, but this one was different. Someone had been there recently. I could tell because the door was still half open, and there was fresh dirt near the threshold. I knew I shouldn't go closer. I should have just turned around, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked cautiously toward it, keeping an eye out for any signs of life, anything that could explain why the door was open. As I neared it, I heard a noise, a soft, faint scraping sound, like something being dragged across the ground. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I was alone, and there was no one around for miles. Then I heard it again, louder this time. It was coming from inside the shack. My breath hitched in my throat as I stood there, unsure of what to do. I could feel the tension building inside me, like a pressure that was slowly choking me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I made my decision. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I didn't even look back. The woods were still behind me, full of the mysteries I would never understand. Camping at Lano Chi was supposed to be the perfect Boy Scout outing. It was one of those camps that everyone talked about, the kind of place where you learned real skills, got dirty, and bonded with your patrol. That year, we were staying in the large canvas tents at one of the more remote sites. There was a small creek nearby and enough trees to make the whole place feel like we were really out in the woods. We set up our cots, unloaded our gear, and settled in for what was supposed to be a peaceful night under the stars. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, and the campfire's glow was a faint memory. It was the kind of night where the air felt thick, cool, and still. The other guys in my patrol were already fast asleep, the slow, rhythmic sound of their breathing filling the tent. But I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in my chest. I had that familiar, sinking feeling, like something was just off. I lay on my cot, staring up at the tent's canvas roof, straining to listen to the sounds of the forest around us. The crickets, the rustling of leaves in the trees, and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. Everything seemed normal, yet everything seemed too quiet at the same time. It was as though the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard it. A faint sound at first, a rustle, just a shift of the tent, nothing too loud. My heart immediately jumped, and I held my breath, straining to make sense of what it was. It wasn't the wind. The air was still. It wasn't an animal either, at least not the typical animals we'd expected around camp, like raccoons or squirrels. This was something else. Something deliberate. The noise came again, this time closer. Soft, almost muffled. A footstep? No, something had definitely entered the tent. I could feel my pulse quicken. My brain was screaming at me to look, to move, to do something, but my body felt paralyzed, frozen in place. It was as if I couldn't move even if I wanted to. I opened my mouth to whisper to the guy sleeping next to me, hoping to make sense of it with someone else's perspective. But the words wouldn't come. My throat was dry, and I was suddenly terrified that if I said anything out loud, I would make whatever it was aware that I was awake. I shifted slightly, just enough to make out the shape of my patrol mate lying on his cot beside me. He didn't stir. No response. Was I just imagining it? Was this some late-night paranoia kicking in? Couldn't tell. The noises continued, now coming from directly next to my cot. Someone was right there. I could hear faint rustling as it shuffled in the darkness. I forced myself to stay still, praying that whatever it was would just leave. The sound seemed to pause for a moment. I dared not look over. My mind raced, desperately trying to explain away what I was hearing. Maybe it was the wind tugging at the canvas. Maybe some animal had gotten inside. But no, this felt too intentional, too calculated. Seconds ticked by, or maybe it was minutes. Time seemed to stretch in a way that only happens when you're absolutely terrified. The sound of something moving next to me ceased, and I held my breath. The absence of sound felt as suffocating as the noise had been. I waited for what felt like an eternity, listening intently for any signs of movement. Finally, there was a soft shuffle, then silence. Whatever had entered the tent was gone. It had slipped out just as quietly as it had come in. I still couldn't make myself move, but I couldn't stay awake either. My eyelids grew heavy, and my exhaustion finally won out. I fell asleep with my mind still racing, trying to make sense of everything. Morning came too soon. I woke up groggy, disoriented, and with that uneasy feeling still crawling up my spine. The light creeping into the tent through the canvas seemed almost too bright, too welcoming after the tension of the night. I tried to shake off the dread that lingered, but something was definitely off. I forced myself out of bed and stretched, trying to act normal. I was trying to convince myself that I had just imagined it all. The forest was full of noises, after all. Maybe it had been a deer or the wind or maybe even a raccoon. But when I stepped outside, I saw it. My trunk, which I had packed just the day before, was wide open. My heart sank. I walked over to it, dread creeping up my back. Inside, everything looked disheveled. Clothes had been pulled out, and some of my gear had been shifted around. But it was the empty bag of Jack Link's beef jerky and the empty wrapper of juicy fruit gum that really made my stomach drop. Those were things I knew I had left packed away in my bag the night before. I froze. The realization hit me like a cold slap. Last night's rustling, the movements in the tent, hadn't been a ghost or my imagination. It had been an animal, a raccoon or possibly more. They had gotten into my trunk, torn open the snacks, and probably made their way through the camp. But I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel better knowing that it was just a bunch of raccoons. The thought of those things, of anything, creeping around our camp in the dead of night, coming into our tent, feeling so close, had me feeling deeply unsettled. It was the kind of thing that you didn't talk about right away, especially not in front of the others, who were just waking up and beginning to make their way out of the tents. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't need to. The mess outside my trunk, the gnaw marks, the chewed up bags. It was enough of a clue for everyone else to piece together. As I stood there in the growing light of morning, My mind replayed last night's events over and over. It wasn't just the fact that the animals had gotten into my stuff. It was the feeling of being watched, of being aware of something lurking just beyond the edge of my senses. And in the back of my mind, I knew it wasn't just the raccoons that had been out there that night. It had been too quiet, too purposeful, too eerie. There had been something in the air, something unsettling in the way the forest had held its breath right alongside me. But as the day unfolded and the other scouts gathered around the campfire to tell stories and laugh, the feeling faded into the background. Everyone seemed too preoccupied with their own thoughts, too busy being scouts to notice. And as we broke camp that afternoon, packing up our tents, I tried my hardest to push the memories from that night to the back of my mind. But I knew deep down that some things stay with you. Some experiences don't just fade away, no matter how hard you try to forget them. And whatever had crept into our tent that night, whatever had rifled through my gear, it wasn't something I'd ever be able to fully explain. All I could do was shake my head and laugh it off when anyone asked about the strange noises from the night before. But the truth was, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods at Lanochi held secrets. Secrets that would always stay just out of reach. And sometimes that was the scariest part of all. I spent a few weeks each summer at a camp in South Carolina when I was a kid. It was one of those old school camps, with cabins, hiking, and all the stuff you'd expect from a place trying to make you feel one with nature. I wasn't particularly into the whole roughing it thing, but I did like some of the activities. Guns, archery, swimming, and karate were the fun parts for me. But the rest of it, not so much. It was just a lot of bugs, dirt, and sitting around the campfire listening to ghost stories from counselors who took their jobs way too seriously. One year, when I was maybe 11 or 12, the counselors decided that our cabin, and one or two others, would go on a camping trip. The spot they picked was about a mile or so down the road from the camp. It was past a small church, then down a little dirt road until you reached a large clearing in the woods. The place was pretty isolated, but at least it was relatively safe, or so they thought. It wasn't like we were out in some wilderness where you could get lost and eaten by something, at least not on the surface. The campfires were lit up by the creek, where we set up our tents and sleeping bags. We camped near the creek, away from the open field where the tree stood. There was this large, single tree in the middle of that field, standing like some kind of lonely sentinel in the dark. The firelight barely made it past the clearing, and beyond that, the woods swallowed everything up. The counselors made sure everyone had flashlights and lanterns, but once it got dark, you realized how far the light didn't reach. The kids at the camp weren't your typical wilderness experts. Most of us came from suburban or city backgrounds, and we had no idea what the real woods were like after dark. We were just kids out there to have fun and cause trouble. As usual, the counselors made the rules clear. No cursing, no fighting, no stealing, and no ignoring them. They seemed to think we were all little devils ready to tear the place apart the minute their backs were turned. So, they set up this strange rule for the camping trip. If you did something wrong after dark, you'd have to walk out to the tree. First, I didn't think much of it. I mean, it was just a tree, right? How bad could it be? But as the sun sank below the horizon, the mood shifted. The warmth from the fire felt like it was getting smaller, and the air turned colder. I stood on the edge of the clearing, staring at that tree. The grass was only knee-high, but it stretched out toward the tree in a way that made it seem farther than it really was. Maybe it was just the darkness, but that tree seemed more imposing the longer I looked at it. The forest beyond it looked even worse. I remember thinking it was weird, but not that weird. I mean, it was just a tree, but something about the way the dark closed in around it, the way the shadows started to twist under the low light, gave me an uneasy feeling. And then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Pairs of yellow eyes, blinking from the edge of the forest. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But no, There were too many of them. It was like staring into the deep, glowing pits of the forest, each pair of eyes reflecting back at me like some kind of warning. I couldn't make out any shapes, but I knew they weren't just bugs or some harmless creatures. They were too low to the ground, about waist height to man height, and that scared the hell out of me. Big animals, large ones. The eyes didn't blink in unison. They moved around, side to side, shifting positions almost like they were tracking me. My stomach dropped, but for some reason, I couldn't look away. The only thing I knew was that I had to walk to that tree. The stupid rule was stuck in my head, pushing me to move, to follow through. Maybe it was peer pressure, maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't scared. But whatever it was, it took over. I took a step forward. I didn't think much of it at first. The firelight still gave me confidence, and at 80 feet away from the tree, I could still see clearly. But as I got closer, everything changed. At 60 feet, the light from the fire started to fade. The darkness crept in like a wet blanket, and I could barely make out anything ahead of me. The ground felt soft beneath my feet, the grass brushing against my legs, but I couldn't see it anymore. I couldn't see my hands, couldn't even see the ground at my feet. It felt like the whole world was closing in on me, and those damn eyes were still watching. At 40 feet, my breathing started to pick up. I felt my chest tighten, my body go cold. I had to keep moving, I told myself. Just touch the tree and come back. But the closer I got, the more the silence weighed down on me. No crickets, no wind in the trees, nothing. Just the pounding of my own heart and the feeling that something was wrong. The eyes were still out there, shifting and following me with that eerie, unblinking stare. 30 feet, I froze. I had no idea why I stopped, but I just did. I could feel my knees shaking, my teeth chattering. I was scared. I don't know if I was scared of what I saw or what I didn't see, but the dread was unbearable. I knew I had to get to the tree, but I also knew I didn't want to. The further I got, the closer the forest seemed to creep up to the tree, and the more I realized that I wasn't alone. I wasn't just walking toward the tree. I was walking toward something, and those eyes were all around me, out of sight but too close. I started to imagine the worst. Wolves, bears, whatever it was, I felt like it could move faster than I could. I could sense it, feel it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I thought about how vulnerable I was, alone in the dark, with nothing but a tree between me and whatever was lurking in the woods. Every movement in the grass, every little shift in the air made me tense up even more. I couldn't hear anything but my breathing and the sound of my own heartbeat, thudding in my chest. I stood there for what felt like hours. I knew I had to just touch the tree and get back to the fire, but something deep down told me that if I ran toward the tree, I wouldn't make it back. Something would be waiting. Couldn't move. I could hear the grass around me, rustling under something heavy, something that wasn't human. It was too quiet, too still, except for the shifting eyes and the soft, almost imperceptible sounds in the underbrush. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. The dread was too much. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. When I finally broke, I didn't just walk back to the fire. I ran. I ran like I've never run before. My feet hit the ground like a stampede, kicking up dirt and grass as I bolted toward the firelight. I didn't look back. Couldn't. I just focused on the orange glow of the flames and ran straight for it, faster than I thought possible. I swear I could feel something behind me, something big, moving in the grass, crashing through the underbrush. The sound of paws, heavy and fast, pushing through the grass like it was coming after me. But I didn't stop. Couldn't. Every step felt like a race against whatever was closing in behind me. I didn't look back until I was at the fire, and even then, I didn't see anything. But I knew. The counselors and other kids were staring at me, and I could barely catch my breath. I don't think anyone understood what had just happened. Maybe they thought I was just freaked out over the dark. Maybe they thought I was being dramatic. But I knew. I felt it. Those eyes, the creatures, whatever they were real. And they were watching me. I never found out what was out there that night. The next day, we packed up and went back to the main camp, and no one spoke about it. The tree stood out there in the clearing, untouched, but I never saw it the same way again. South Carolina, with its thick woods and thick dark, had something lurking in it, and I knew, deep down, that whatever those eyes were, they'd always be out there, waiting. It was the summer when I was 13, and our family took a road trip up the west coast to Oregon. It was one of those spontaneous trips. Nothing planned too far in advance, just a long drive to see the sights, stretch our legs, and let the days unfold however they wanted. We didn't have any particular destination in mind, but we ended up stopping at a beach just past Newport. It was a gray, foggy day, which was typical for the Oregon coast, and we didn't mind. The mist was thick, almost like the ocean itself had decided to rise up and swallow the land whole. We piled out of the car and made our way down to the shore. The beach was almost completely empty, save for a few scattered tourists, probably not sticking around for long with the fog rolling in like that. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks was hypnotic, a constant, rhythmic boom that almost drowned out the wind. The sand beneath my feet was cold and damp, the air salty and sharp. My parents stayed close to the car, unpacking a picnic, while I drifted off on my own, enjoying the solitude. There was something peaceful about walking alone on a beach with the fog so thick that it felt like the world had been reduced to just you, the ocean, and the air. I could barely make out the silhouettes of my family behind me. As I walked farther down the shore, my curiosity took over. The beach wasn't exactly flat. It was littered with rocks and odd bits of driftwood, like nature had just thrown its garbage into the sea and let it wash up here. The sand was churned up, and every few steps, I'd kick a stray stick or piece of driftwood out of the way. I didn't mind the fog. If anything, it felt like it added to the mystery of the beach, like I was walking through an old dream. Eventually, I noticed something odd out of the corner of my eye. I was getting farther from the main stretch of beach, and there, just off to the side, was a little lagoon. It was more like a massive tide pool, the water dark and slick with seaweed. I figured it must have been formed from the ocean moving in and out, carving out a small pocket in the sand. I stopped for a second, watching the water lap gently at the edge of the lagoon. The fog was thick around me now, the air colder, and I hugged my jacket tighter around me. I started walking around the outside of the lagoon, taking care not to slip on the wet rocks scattered along the shore. It wasn't until I got about halfway around that I saw something strange. Sticks sticking up out of the sand in random spots. At first, I thought they were just more pieces of driftwood, like the kind that's scattered all over the beach. But then I realized something wasn't right. The sticks weren't just lying there, they were standing up, shoved deep into the sand. And not just a few of them, there were a whole bunch, all pointed in different directions. I stepped closer, intrigued but also feeling a little uneasy. People do weird things on beaches, especially in Oregon. Some tourists build little huts or shacks with driftwood, but this wasn't anything like that. I crouched down, trying to get a better look, and that's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. The sticks weren't just sticks anymore. They were pikes poking out of the sand, and they weren't empty. Something was attached to the top of each one. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at, but then it clicked, and I felt my stomach drop. Animal heads, real animal heads with the bodies nowhere in sight. Each head was shoved onto the end of a stick, like some twisted trophy display. The first one I noticed was a pelican, its beak long and sharp, eyes wide open in a permanent stare. The feathers were disheveled, like the bird had been dead for days. Another stick had the head of a seagull, its beady eyes frozen in a glassy stare. And then I saw it. A seal, its round eyes still eerily intact, its face frozen in what looked like an agonized expression. The seal's head was much larger than the others, its weight dragging the stick down so it almost touched the ground. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, processing what I was seeing. The fog around me seemed to thicken, the world shrinking down to just this little patch of beach. I could feel the chill creeping into my bones, and I felt nauseous. Why would someone do this? Who would do this? I stepped back, but as I did, my eyes caught more details. At first, I thought the sticks were just scattered around, but now I saw that they were arranged in a sort of pattern. Some were positioned in a semicircle, others jutting out at odd angles, forming an unnatural boundary around the lagoon. There were other carcasses, too. Dead seagulls, a couple of pelicans, all of them scattered across the sand like some kind of grotesque offering. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run, but my feet felt frozen in place, my legs weak, like they couldn't move fast enough. I tried to think of any reason this could be happening. Maybe it was some sort of art project, maybe a bizarre local custom, but nothing made sense. My heart was pounding in my chest, and the fog was so thick now that it felt like the world was closing in on me. I couldn't stand it any longer. I turned and started walking as fast as I could back toward my family, the fog swirling around me like it was alive, thickening the farther I went. I didn't look back, afraid of what I might see if I did. I just focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on getting back to my family, where I would be safe. As I reached the edge of the beach, I spotted my parents and brother still by the car, setting up a blanket. I could tell they hadn't noticed me gone for long, and I didn't plan on telling them what I had found. Not yet. I didn't want to freak them out or make them think I was imagining things. But I couldn't shake the image of those animal heads on the sticks, staring out at the ocean, their dead eyes frozen forever in the mist. We didn't stay much longer after that. My parents packed up the picnic and we left the beach, the fog still hanging heavy in the air as we drove away. I didn't say anything about what I'd seen, but I could tell my mind was racing. What had I stumbled upon? Why were the animal heads there? Who had done this and why? I've never gone back to that beach. In fact, I haven't gone back to any beach on the Oregon coast since. The memory of that place, the fog, the eerie silence, the dead animals, haunts me. It feels like a warning, like I had walked too close to something I wasn't supposed to see. I can still picture it so clearly in my mind. The lagoon, the sticks sticking up from the sand, the twisted remains of the animals. I don't know what kind of person could do something like that, but I don't want to know. It's a memory I don't ever want to relive. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm on a beach walking alone. The fog always reminds me of that day, of that place, and the feeling that I was never supposed to see what I saw. Maybe it was just some sick, twisted prank, or maybe it was something more, something darker, something that shouldn't have been left out there for anyone to find. I'll never know for sure, but I've learned one thing. There are some things you're better off not knowing, and sometimes it's best to just keep walking and pretend you never saw them. That night still haunts me. I was in middle school, probably 12 or 13 at the time. My best friend and I had been excited about this camping trip for weeks. It was a summer camp with other kids our age, and we were both looking forward to the freedom that came with being away from home. The campsite was small, set up on a patch of flat land surrounded by trees, not far from a road. You could hear the occasional car driving by, but that night it was quiet, like most of the cars had already gone home for the day. We were sleeping in a platform tent, the kind of tent that sits above the ground with a wooden frame and mesh sides. The floor had a layer of thick canvas, which was pretty comfortable to sleep on. My friend and I had claimed the far side of the tent, closest to the edge of the woods, while the group leaders were a bit farther across the campsite in their own platform tent. Felt like a safe distance, but that would change by the middle of the night. The evening had been spent doing the usual camp activities, campfire songs, some hiking, and a bit of stargazing. After a few hours of talking, we finally crawled into our sleeping bags, settling in for what we thought would be a typical night under the stars. We were both a bit nervous, but it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. It was dark, but we weren't scared, at least not until it happened. I woke up at some point well after midnight. I wasn't sure exactly what had pulled me out of my sleep, but I could feel that something wasn't right. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I tried to shake off the grogginess of sleep. It was quiet, except for the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of a car driving by on the road. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a human figure standing between the trees. The figure was still just standing there, watching us. I could see the outline of a person, but they were too far away to make out any details. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a tightness in my throat. I wasn't sure if it was real or if I was just seeing things, but then I noticed my friend stirring beside me. I didn't make a sound, but she must have felt the same eerie sensation because, without saying anything, she slowly opened her eyes. She must have seen what I saw because she froze, and I could feel her hand reaching for mine in the dark. The connection was instant, like we both knew something was terribly wrong. We didn't speak, but our hands found each other, gripping tightly, silently acknowledging the terror we were both feeling. The figure stayed in place for what felt like forever. I couldn't tell what it was doing, but it didn't seem like it was going anywhere. I was too scared to breathe too loudly, worried that it might hear me and get closer. The wind had picked up a bit, and I could hear the leaves rustling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the person in the trees was watching us, waiting for something. My friend's hand in mine was the only thing that made me feel slightly grounded. We lay there, completely still, barely moving, hoping that whatever it was would just go away. But it didn't. The figure began to move. It circled our tent. Slowly, like it was testing the perimeter, walking around us 3 times. It was methodical, almost like it was trying to figure out how to get closer or whether we were asleep. I could hear its footsteps crunching through the dry leaves and twigs, the sound loud in the otherwise silent night. Every time it passed by, my heart would race faster, and I'd squeeze my friend's hand harder. We didn't dare make a sound. The tension in the air felt like it was suffocating me, but I didn't want to give away that we were awake. I wasn't sure if it was a person who meant us harm, or if they were just wandering, but every instinct in my body screamed at me that something was wrong. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the figure stopped. I heard it moving away from the tent, back down the hill. The footsteps got softer as it disappeared into the trees, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I let out a shaky breath. I wasn't sure if the danger had passed, but I knew we couldn't stay in the tent any longer. We didn't talk. There was no need to. Both of us knew we couldn't stay here alone in the dark anymore. We waited for a while, listening carefully to make sure the figure wasn't circling back. After what felt like an eternity, we finally decided to crawl out of our sleeping bags. We had to be quiet, as if the smallest sound would alert the figure that we were awake. With our hearts still pounding, we slowly unzipped the door to the tent and peeked out. The campsite was eerily silent. There was no sign of anyone or anything near us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. We didn't even dare leave the tent to go to the group leaders, who were still sleeping, because we were terrified that if we did, we'd be vulnerable. We huddled together in the corner of the tent, not sure what to do next, but knowing we couldn't go back to sleep. By morning, the sun started to rise, casting a soft light over the campsite. I didn't feel any safer, but the light at least gave me the courage to venture out. We quietly slipped out of the tent, trying not to wake anyone up. We didn't say a word to the group leaders or any of the other campers. Not because we didn't want to share, but because I didn't even know how to explain what we had seen. We never talked about it in detail to anyone else that day. There was a weird silence between my friend and me, like we both didn't want to acknowledge what had happened. But even after camp ended and we went back to our normal lives, we both brought it up at random times. We'd look at each other, and the memory would come flooding back, like a shadow that refused to leave. It wasn't until much later that we realized how lucky we were. At the time, I couldn't understand why someone would be out there, alone in the dark, just watching kids sleep. As we grew older, we talked about it more, wondering if it had been someone lost or someone with worse intentions. We never knew, and maybe that was the scariest part, the uncertainty of it all. But one thing we knew for sure was that it had been real. And to this day, neither of us has forgotten the way we felt that night, lying there in the dark, holding hands and waiting for something to happen. The memory still lingers, not just of the figure in the trees, but of the fear that wrapped itself around us like a cold, suffocating blanket. We never went back to that campsite, and we never went camping in that area again. And now, whenever we talk about that night, we both agree on one thing. It wasn't the kind of fear you can forget. It sticks with you, always there, a reminder that sometimes the world is scarier than we want to believe.